al-Athar al-Islamiyyah is truly delighted to welcome Mercedes Volait to speak here tonight. She comes to us from the prestigious CNRS, which translates into English, excuse me, the National Center for Scientific Research. The center is a public organization under the responsibility of the French Ministry of Education and Research, and includes research in a wide variety of areas, including humanities and social sciences. The DAR has had the honor of a number of scholars from this institution presenting lectures here in the past. Architect and historian Mercedes Volait is research professor at CNRS and editor of a digital research center as well. These modest titles belly the multifaceted range of her interests and studies. She is particularly concerned with a perspective of cultural history, architecture, and urbanism of the 19th and 20th century in Egypt, as well as the protection of Cairo's architectural heritage. She has produced a long list of books and articles, too long to mention here. One only has to Google her name to find out about these works. This makes this evening's discussion all more intriguing because Professor Volait will be introducing us to a new dimension of architectural history. In a lecture entitled Engaging the Art and Architecture of Cairo in the 19th Century, a cross-cultural perspective, she will be dealing with a previously neglected area of Egyptian art history. We've had many lectures on various phases of the art and architecture of Egypt from ancient times to medieval, but this is the first time we will review documented archival material from the modern period, including the revival of Mamluk art and architecture in the 19th century in Cairo. And let's welcome Professor Mercedes Volait.
The topic of my talk tonight is about the fascination that the historic architecture of Cairo exerted all throughout the 19th century, and indeed before that, but let's concentrate on the 19th century, on scholars and designers, and the impact this interest had on the creative level, from interior decoration and applied arts to architecture, both in Egypt and elsewhere. The two buildings on my first slide are 19th century French outcomes of this mania or philia, and I will come back to both of them at one point in my talk. Although the focus of the attention was on Islamic monuments of any period, whether Tulunid, Ayyubid, Fatimid, even Ottoman, or Mamluk, it is this latter term that is often used generically to define the full range of Cairene historic architecture. So when speaking of this Mamluk revival, it's in a very broad sense. The concern for this architecture can be traced back to the 18th century and even before, but accounts did become more systematic after the French expedition in Egypt and the famous multi-volume encyclopedia known as the Description de l'Égypte that came out of it, and of which a couple of plates are illustrated here. Then each new publication built on the previous one, and in a way, the flow of works has not stopped ever since. But in any case, I don't think that we have fully grasped to this day the magnitude of the phenomenon. mostly because only few surveys have been fully studied so far. The most famous one, like this one, the Grand Portfolio, published by French architect Pascal Coste from 1834 to 1839 after a 10-year stay in Egypt. And it is indeed one of my intentions tonight to bring to the forefront less known episodes of the craze for the architecture of Cairo in the past 2 centuries. The 1840s, for example, were particularly fruitful in what regards the French artistic connection to Cairene architecture. These are the years during which aristocrat Giraud de Pranger, for example, produced hundreds, literally hundreds, of precious daguerreotypes of Cairo mosques and minarets, now worth a fortune on the art market. And as you know, daguerreotype was a very sophisticated photographic process which worked with sheets of silver-plated copper, so it was quite heavy, fully polished and then made light sensitive with fumes. During his 2-year stay in Cairo, Giraud de Pranger produced 1,800 views of Islamic monuments, a considerable achievement with a special interest for domes and minarets as the one illustrated here. The 1840s were also years that saw another man, Adalbert de Beaumont, an influential character of the artistic scene in Paris, that developed strange theories about the natural origins of ornamental motif in Cairo. He associated the patterns with a sea organism, but more importantly, he drew those motifs and later turned his drawings into patterns for ceramic production. So in France, people became more acquainted with this art, even if it was not the real thing, but a reproduction. The major survey carried out during the following decade, that is in the 1850s, was the one made by Émile Prisdaven, an artist and historian who spent 2 years recording, with the assistance of a Dutch draughtsman and a French photographer, monuments and ornaments in Cairo from 1858 to 1860. The 3 men brought back to Paris hundreds of drawings, tracings, squeezes, and photographs. We see some of the material collected here, for example. And for those interested, all has been digitized now and is available online on the Gallica platform. The whole material is interesting because it also offers an opportunity to study the process of editing that took place from an original sketch to the published plate. And for example, you can see here how they wanted to show more this, so they just suppressed this part to give more attention here. Pris's engagement with Egyptian Islamic architecture was a lifelong one. We can see here some of his early drawings while he was living in Egypt as an employee of Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, as were many Europeans at the time. He knew well the country, he spoke the language, and indeed considered fluency in Arabic as a prerequisite to properly study Arab art, as he stated in his notebooks. You can see on the slide my translation of his quote: "Whatever one's talent, one should become an Arabist to study Arab art or translate poetry from the Jahiliyyah. It is by entering body and soul in the life of Muslims, by speaking their language, by respecting their religion, by marrying their prejudices, that I was able to penetrate somehow in the manners and customs of the Arab of the past." The outcome of this expedition was a grand album with 200 color plates and a comprehensive text, which took actually 20 years to be produced. There was something like 60 engravers who worked on the book, something unthinkable in our time of speed and instantaneity, and a business that got him into bankruptcy. One has to bear in mind, and this is important, that the work of these people, like that of many other, of Émile Prisdaven and others, was not an official endeavor, but a private initiative with all risks falling on the author. But the book eventually became a must-have, if we are to believe the number of modern editions, the latest by Stashken in 2011, that were released. The task of surveying monuments in Cairo was not an easy job either, according to the few accounts that recall the experience. Cairo, as you know, was torrid half the year round. Remember, no AC at the time. It was plagued with diseases, and it was already overpopulated. One man recounts the trick he used to draw at ease in Cairo street by riding a camel, and one wished to have been there to witness the scene. Many monuments were crumbling down and were dangerous structure to stay in, while getting into religious buildings require, on the other hand, specific know-how. Nevertheless, Cairene architecture continued stirring passions, and not only Gallic ones. British artists produced their own share of sketches and watercolors depicting domestic architecture in Cairo. Images could be repetitive. A good example is provided by the many representations of the mandara of the so-called Beit el-Mufti, the house of the Mufti at the time, by German, British, French, and indeed Czech artists. This is by a Czech artist. I will just come back to him in a minute. Because the house was inoccupied since the early 1860s, and even before, if we are to believe drawings made by the Swiss architect Theodor Zelander in 1848, and therefore it was of easier access to artists and travelers. The raison d'être, and now I'm more coming to Mamluk revivalism, the raison d'être of such effort were diverse. To some, such as Pries d'Aven, or the group of German artists who gathered in Cairo in 1875 to produce Orientalist paintings, these were mainly scholarly or artistic pursuits. For others, they were design-oriented. Architect Pascal Coste stated clearly that he had embarked upon surveying architecture in Cairo when he was commissioned by Muhammad Ali to design a mosque at the Citadel. And whether this was true or not, he did draft one of the very early recorded projects in Mamluk style that was not implemented in the end because the Basha shows instead a Turkish style structure, the one illustrated on the left side of the slide. The Swiss architect that I just mentioned, Theodor Zerleder, also drew monuments in Cairo for design purposes. In his case, to install a smoking room in the castle of Oberhofen near Bern for a Swiss diplomat who had his career in the Ottoman Empire. I wonder if a diplomat will do such thing today. Another amateur of Cairene architecture was architect Ambroise Baudry, who lived in Cairo during the reign of Khedive Ismail in the 1870s. He was to specialize in Mamluk revivalism and design in Egypt, as well as in France when back home, some of the most spectacular early instances of modern Arabic style, as it was called at the time, inspired by Cairene architecture, le style arabe. We have here one of his early achievements, the house of Count Saint-Maurice, who was in charge of the stables of Khedive Ismail in Cairo. Count Saint-Maurice was a devoted collector of Islamic art and architecture and indulged into a house built out of reused material from structure to be demolished in Cairo and Damascus. The house's central piece was a cruciform hall, the car, illustrated on this slide, and it had many other rooms around, and it was also several floors. But I don't want to bore you too much with the detailed story of how this house came into being, and moreover, what was its actual life, because it's a very long and a very complicated story that could fill a whole lecture in itself. But anyway, one can get at least an impression of the scale and ambition of the achievement from these few images. So this is the beautiful door and opening, the opening door of the embassy, this incredible piece from the 14th century named to Bebars the First. We have also these doors. Some are, no, many are now in the Victoria and Albert Museum because he sold part of his collection to the British. And the house is long gone now, but part of it survived in a new setting, the French embassy in Cairo. And this case offers plenty to think about adaptive reuse or creative preservation, not necessarily as we understand them today, but as it was practiced in the 19th century at a time when it had become a sort of industry in France in particular. Baudry also designed, next door to the Saint-Maurice mansion, the house of another devoted collector of Islamic art, Baron Alphonse Delors de Guéléon, actually the one to which the Louvre owes the first big nucleus of its Islamic collection. We are fortunate enough to have in this instance a visual testimony of the house's social life, a place for the performing arts in appropriate settings. Delors de Guéléon, in turn, become a would-be architect, investing in a salon arabe for his Parisian house and commissioning the famous Cairo Street at the 1889 World Fair in Paris, pieces of which were actually reused after war to build a second villa in Cairo, as well as a summer house in Normandy. I already showed it. It was one of the first slides. So the story of Mamluk revivalism is also one of moving rooms and traveling stones, long-distance traveling for that matter, and this represents a full chapter of a specific material culture that still needs to be fully studied. Baudry's design in the Mamluk style included, moreover, his own house in Cairo, where he displayed his collection in ways that were quite creative, as in the case, for example, of these tiles as tour de porte around doors. Similar to what we already saw in Saint-Maurice house, Baudry also designed furniture reusing antiques, as in this cupboard now in the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, with carved polygons, in fact, of the 14th century, inlaid in a modern frame. So also this is a problem in a way for museums now. How you curate these pieces? Are they 14th century pieces? Are they modern pieces? How you come to terms with these hybrid objects? Baudry also designed a mausoleum for an Italian merchant in Naples. It was built, but in a modified version. He also designed interiors for a mansion in Brittany and several smoking rooms in France. This one of Odon de Toulouse-Lautrec, and this one for Edmond de Rothschild. Of note is the vertical display of rugs in a tobacco-fied atmosphere, a quite common feature at the time that is not exactly our current understanding of art preservation. The last project of Ambroise Baudry in the Mamluk style was a mosque heavily inspired by his favorite monument in Cairo, the Qaitbay Mosque in the Eastern Cemetery, a structure that was to be erected in Paris but that never went through. As most of his clients, Baudry was a collector himself of Islamic art. We see here some of the very fine pieces that he was able to assemble while living in Cairo, and among which he lived for the rest of his life. This is a beautiful Islamic chinoiserie, and you have also many woodwork in his collection, and this magnificent also Fatimid piece. And also it's important for this piece that curators, when the piece entered the museum at the end of the 19th century, thought that it was Mamluk because it was found on a Mamluk site, the site of a Mamluk building. But in fact, Ambroise Baudry knew that it was Fatimid, and we don't know actually how he could know that that was Fatimid and not Mamluk. And this is so the apartment of Ambroise Baudry when back home in Paris. Meanwhile, in France, other art amateurs also embarked on designing Oriental rooms in their Parisian homes. This was the case of Albert Goupil, a famous art dealer and collector, of which we see here some views of the way his collection was displayed, with again the vertical display of rugs and all these objects around the room. So the Goupil setting. So this French milieu of early connoisseurs and amateurs of Islamic art, collecting art and designing their domestic space were two deeply entangled activities. Another major mediator and interpreter of Mamluk architecture from the same generation but of a very distinct background is the Czech architect František Šmoranec. Šmoranec was brought to Cairo by the same frenzy that had channeled many architects to the land of the pharaohs, the Cairo building boom orchestrated by Khedive Ismail. Šmoranec started working in 1868 for a Khedival palace, received further architectural commissions from Ismail and his entourage until he was granted in 1872 the task to build the Egyptian section at the Vienna World Fair. In the meantime, he had gathered extraordinary drawings of religious and domestic architecture in Cairo. We have already seen one briefly, the one of the Mufti House, and we are seeing more here. They were made for publication on Islamic architecture that in fact never saw the light. But the richness and accuracy of details is particularly remarkable, and the archaeological value of these drawings is indeed quite high, since most of the buildings he drew no longer exist. In any event, his understanding and knowledge of Islamic architecture in Cairo gave a very special flavor to the buildings he designed for the Egyptian section in Vienna, an impressive group of buildings with amazing resemblance to the real thing, if it is obviously stage architecture. But when I explain to people that this is in Vienna, generally very few people believe me. Back home in the following years, Šmoranec was to use his drawings of ornament in Cairo for glass design for the Lobmeyer company in Vienna, and indeed produced Egyptian-inspired tile design for a Hungarian factory, the Volait company. But more importantly, perhaps, Šmoranec was the founder, builder, and first director in 1885 of the School of Decorative Arts in Prague, a school that trained architects that were sent throughout the Austrian Empire afterwards, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, where they were in charge of conceiving a national style for official buildings, choosing for that matter an adaptation of the Mamluk style, as in the famous library of Sarajevo, that includes multiple references to architecture in Cairo. Interestingly enough, this architectural style is now known as the Bosniak style in Sarajevo, and the connection to Egyptian architecture and the Czech architect that channeled it to Bosnia and Herzegovina is almost lost. Images where drawings or photography played an important part in the dissemination of Mamluk aesthetics and forms. Although initially published in expensive publications, only affordable to the happy few, the visual records ended up circulating as engravings in the general press. By the 1890s, a solid body of visual evidence, soon to be supplemented by commercial photography, like we see here, had made Mamluk art and architecture accessible to much larger audiences than the privileged traveler. Pictures of monuments in Cairo were available at most photography retailers in late 19th century Paris, and I suspect it was the case elsewhere too. And it was actually thanks to such wide circulation of Egyptian photography and the random arrival of a collection of views of Egyptian architecture at the School of Architecture in Barcelona that the famous Catalan architect Antonio Gaudí was induced to build this striking El Capricho, a summer cottage in northern Spain, characterized by its turret-like minaret and stripped facade inspired by photographs of Cairo and Alex he saw in his school. And I will venture that this Sultan Hassan portal-like building in Baku owes more to photography than to direct experience of Cairo architecture. I don't know for the Baku architect, but Gaudi, as a matter of fact, never went to Egypt. For the last part of my talk, I would like to return one more time to Egypt to explore this time a less known aspect of the story, the way in which it could resonate on the Egyptian side. My postulate here, like some people here know, is that although predominantly European, the craze for Mamluk art was far from being purely a Western phenomenon. The interest in and revival of Mamluk art and architecture involved local agency as well. An early significant event is the display of a collection of Islamic woodwork by an Egyptian amateur at the Paris World Fair in 1867. The exhibit represented to most visitors the very first exposure to Mamluk craftsmanship, and indeed offered the opportunity to erect an early Mamluk-style building in the vicinity of Paris through the reuse of material from the pavilion, one of the pavilion, after the fair was over. So you see this recycling and recycling again. Hussein Fahmi al-Ma'amar, the author of the display, is not very different from the cast of characters that I have mentioned so far. He was trained as an architect, worked at restoring some mosques, was an art amateur, collected Islamic salvages, and did engage in Islamic style design for a mosque to be erected in Cairo, the Rifai Mosque, that was in fact completed much later on with a distinct design at a time when the Mamluk style had become the official style promoted by the administration of Awqaf for religious buildings. We have here some examples by Sabir Sabri, the chief engineer of the Waqf administration in Egypt at the time. So a full industry well beyond architecture was to develop in Egypt in the context of Mamluk revivalism. Many crafts were concerned, cabinet making, and here, for example, the company of Gasparo Giuliana, and the showroom of another one, a very important one, led by the Italian Giuseppe Parvis. There was glasswork as well. We see here, again, some examples probably made for the Rifai Mosque, and indeed metalwork, lamps, dock knockers, bronze ornament a la Mamluk were available to the interested customer. Mamluk style was not only a style used for official buildings. Influential individuals also engaged in reviving Mamluk architecture. Boros Nubar Pasha, the creator of Heliopolis and the son of a famous minister of Khedive Ismail, commissioned the building of several fountains in Mamluk style, as this one in Sayyida Zainab in Abbasiyya, built in 1908 to honor the soul and spirit of his late father by offering free water to the poor at a time when there was almost no running water in the city. Others used the Mamluk style for their houses. The Zorebs, for example, had their palace in central Cairo, built in that style, next door to the villa of Oda Sha'arawi, the famous Egyptian advocate of women's rights, in the very same style, and with reused pieces as well. Another example, Said, the palace of Sayyid Alim. And it was her brother, Umar Sultan, who built the most extraordinary neo-Mamluk ensemble in Cairo that was known locally as Dar el-Mathaf, where he had installed his art collection. In this case, the love of art objects provided an essential drive and led to imagine creative settings for their display. So we can say in a way that things do have power, the power to reconfigure one's own private space. I would like to conclude this overview of Mamluk revival in art and architecture by adding that the tradition of reuse, in itself a very ancient tradition that cut across many cultures, mostly all cultures, is still alive in Egypt and probably elsewhere too. A couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to commission a profile of a house in Fayoum that his owner and designer calls the architect's dream. It was designed by Omar Farouk, one of Hassan Fatih's disciples, and it took 23 years to complete. Only one man in Cairo, El-Ma'alem Ashur, knew how to carve muqarnas, and Omar el-Farouk was keen on choosing the right element for the right place, no matter how much time this would take. In the interview, he stated that connoisseurship, his gusto for Islamic objects, the opportunity to discuss them with other amateurs and art dealers, played in fact an important part in its intimate attachment to Islamic architecture and the way he came to understand it. In a seminar yesterday at Kuwait University, we discussed the notion and issue of heritage and how one can relate to heritage through the built environment. We might extend the idea to include art objects and fragments as well, since they too can be powerful agents in that process. Thank you very much.